Welcome to Class 8 English lesson on 12th August 2021. Today we are going to learn the story King Sindbad and his Falcon. It is an extract from the Arabian Nights. Let's read an interesting story of King Sindbad and his pet falcon and how the king punished his pet when she did not listen to him. Once there was a king named Sindbad. The king was pleasure-loving and in particular very fond of racing and hunting. The king had brought up a falcon as his pet. Wherever the king went, the bird went with him. Even at night, the falcon stayed with him on his fist. The king had a golden cup tied around her neck to provide her drink during hunting. One day, when the king was sitting in his palace in a leisurely mood, the falcon said to the king, "O great king, now the time is suitable for hunting." The king liked a suggestion. He ordered his subordinates to make the necessary arrangements for the hunt. The king set out hunting with the falcon on his fist. The king and his men continued to travel till they reached a valley. His men formed a circular shroud of a net intended for the victim. Soon a gazelle was trapped within the net. The excited king cried, "Beware! Whoever allows the gazelle to escape from there will be punished to death." The net was lifted by the king's hunting troop from all the sides. Gradually they began narrowing the net's circle to trap the gazelle. She too moved towards the king and stood on her hind legs. She then lifted her forelegs up to her breast, suddenly jumped above the head of the king, and escaped out of the maze, thus thwarting the whole effort. The king turned towards his men. He noticed them murmuring and pointing towards him. The king asked his wazir, "O wazir, do my men want to say something?" The wazir replied, "Your Majesty, they are saying that you have warned that you will kill the person who lets the gazelle escape." The king replied, "I vow to bring her back and will not return till I accomplish it." Saying this, the king galloped on his horse on the route that the gazelle had fled. The falcon, the king's hunting mate, flew high up and traced the fleeing gazelle. She at once swooped down and blinded the gazelle with her talons. The king immediately struck his mace at the blinded gazelle and ended the matter forever. He then cut the gazelle's throat, removed its skin from the body, and hung the spoils on the saddle. It was midday, and the place where they were wandering was devoid of any water source. The king and his horse were thirsty. The king went further in search of water. Finally, they reached a place where water was seen dripping through the leaves of a tree. The king was wearing a skin gauntlet to protect him from any poison. As his falcon was very thirsty, the king took out the cup from her neck and filled it with the dripping liquid. He then placed the cup in front of the falcon. But surprisingly enough, the falcon overturned the cup instead of drinking it. The king picked up the cup, filled it again, and placed it in front of the falcon. But the falcon upset it again with her talons. The king was annoyed at the falcon's strange behavior. Next time, he filled the cup with the dripping liquid and placed it in front of his horse. However, annoyingly enough, the falcon hastily upset it again. The king became furious. He shouted at the falcon in anger, "You unlucky and foolish thing! You are not willing to slake your thirst, nor are you allowing the horse to drink it." In his fury, the king took out his sword and chopped off the wings of the falcon. The falcon cried in pain. She then indicated the king to look up by raising her head. The king's eyes followed the falcon. He saw a poisonous viper lying up above the tree. The liquid, which he mistook as water, was drops of the snake's poison. The king was very remorseful for cutting off the wings of his loyal and beloved falcon. He rode on his horse and returned to his camp along with the dead gazelle. The falcon was still sitting on his fist. As soon as the king reached the camp and sat comfortably, the falcon, which was bearing the pain till then, suddenly gasped and succumbed to death. The repentant king cried aloud to lose his faithful companion who had saved his life. The end. Students, after reading the story, we have to do the following checklist. List all the animals and birds mentioned in the story. So we need to recall all the animals and even the bird that was mentioned in the story. List all the characters in the story. The characters already there in the title, but we need to read further to see which are the other characters or who are the other characters mentioned in the story. Next is we need to draw a storyboard or a story timeline with beginning, middle, and ending. So we need to sequence the story events accordingly, and we also needed to be able to narrate the story events in our own words. Then summarize the story in your own words. So if we are able to retell the story in our own words, we have achieved the lesson objectives. Underline the new words and infer their meaning while reading the story. So if we come across any new word while reading the story silently or aloud, we need to read the text without consulting the glossary list. The glossary list can be then referred to after reading the story. But while reading the story, this is what we need to do. Underline the dialogues or conversation in the story for explaining with reference to context. So we need to underline who said to whom and when was it said and why was it said. Identify the theme, setting, and moral of the story. So what is the moral of the story? Most of us know the moral of the story. It's think twice before you act. Haste makes waste. And cruelty to animals. The theme cruelty to animals or birds, as King Sindbad cut the wings of his falcon without even thinking about what could be the consequences, why the bird was alerting him to the liquid that was dripping from the tree. Identify the setting of the story. Did the story take place in the forest? Did it take place in a desert? Or did it take place during a hunting expedition? So we need to identify the setting of the story correctly. So these are the important aspects while reading story that we need to consider. We don't just read a story for the sake of reading it. We need to understand it, comprehend it to be able to answer questions from the story.